Four Gulf states collectively control some of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, and during Donald Trump's Gulf tour in May 2025, pledged hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. investments. Three of the four big Gulf economies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar, have begun an internal review to determine whether force majeure clauses can be invoked in current contracts. The security arrangement that was supposed to protect them turned them into targets. By March 8, the UAE reported that 1,422 drones and 246 missiles had been fired at its territory. Kuwait recorded 406 drones and 219 missiles. Qatar reported 63 drones, 129 missiles, and 2 aircraft. And Bahrain intercepted 164 drones and 95 missiles, each one a strike on energy infrastructure they were told American bases would protect. Each one a missile aimed at territory hosting U.S. forces that became lightning rods instead of shields. Each one moving closer to facilities like Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG plant, where a drone strike forced the world's second-largest LNG producer to declare force majeure, and Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery, which processes 550,000 barrels per day. A prominent Emirati businessman asked Trump directly, "Who gave you the authority to drag our region into a war with Iran?" These countries have the right to ask today, where did this money go? Are we funding peace initiatives or funding a war that exposes us to danger? Washington does not have an answer to that question. Neither does Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait City, or Doha. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no institutional backing, no advertiser pressure telling us what angles to avoid or which allies to protect. If this kind of analysis matters to you, the kind that follows the structural breaks in real time, not the official narrative 3 months later, consider supporting this work directly. The link is in the description. Independent analysis exists only as long as people who need it choose to fund it. The breakdown did not happen overnight. It accumulated across 14 months of strategic miscalculation. In January 2026, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE all stated they would not allow the U.S. to use their airspace to attack Iran. The signal was clear. The warning was delivered at the highest diplomatic levels. When the joint strikes by the United States and Israel killed Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in late February, Iran targeted U.S. military assets across Gulf Cooperation Council states. It was Israeli bellicosity that led to the initial bombing of Iran, but it is the United States Gulf partners that have borne the brunt of retaliatory strikes because of the presence of multiple military facilities. Gulf officials reviewed the situation individually, and it looked manageable. Isolated strikes, intercepted projectiles, temporary production halts. Reviewed together, it was catastrophic. Declining energy revenues due to reduced output or shipping disruptions, losses in tourism and aviation, and increased defense spending all added to the burden. Oil and gas shipping from the Gulf is essentially frozen. Sea vessels operating in the Gulf received messages on the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, according to the UK Maritime Trade Operations Agency. By the time Washington and its Gulf partners assembled the full picture of what Iran's response structure actually looked like, there was no picture left to act on. The retaliation was not building. It had already arrived. To understand why this rewrites the strategic map of Gulf security, you need to understand what these states actually are in relation to American power projection. For 33 years, since Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the United States developed a network of complementary military installations across the southern shore of the Persian Gulf. The arrangement operated on two premises. The financial costs and security risks of hosting U.S. bases appeared relatively small compared to the perceived benefits of American protection, and the bond created by long-term military infrastructure would give host countries leverage in Washington. In just a few days, the hollowness of both premises has been put on full display. It was Israeli bellicosity that led to the initial bombing of Iran, but it is the United States Gulf partners that have borne the brunt of retaliatory strikes. Before, Gulf states hosted American forces and received security guarantees in exchange. The bases were insurance. If Iran attacked, America would defend. If threats emerged, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, Al Udeid in Qatar, Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, and Ali Al Salam in Kuwait formed an integrated early warning and response architecture. Rather than U.S. bases keeping the Gulf out of the conflict, they have pulled the Gulf states deeper in. What were intended to be ironclad shields have been turned into lightning rods. Despite hosting U.S. troops and assets, GCC states feel that America has not provided adequate protection against Iranian attacks, with some Arab officials publicly voicing anger. arguing that U.S. defenses prioritized American and Israeli interests over Gulf security. The technical failure runs deeper. Iranian missiles reportedly destroyed key radar systems in the U.S. regional missile defense architecture, including the AN/FPS-132 early warning radar in Qatar, which cost approximately $1.1 billion and could take years to replace. That is not a tactical loss. That is a force multiplier for further Iranian strikes. Every missing node in the sensor network creates expanding blind spots. To date, no Gulf state has access to the U.S.'s F-35 fighters. Israel is currently the only country in the region with access to these stealth fighter jets. The hierarchy is structural, not accidental. Now hold all of that in your mind and multiply it by the political reality that the United States is now deeply involved in a conflict whose initial assumptions appear to have been shaped heavily by Israeli strategic preferences, not to mention Netanyahu's desire to remain in office and out of jail. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. Hit the bell. The financial decisions coming out of Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait City, and Doha are moving in real time, and the next sovereign wealth fund announcement will not wait for you to catch up. The Gulf states now face 4 apparent responses. Every single one fails under examination. Option 1, continue hosting U.S. bases and accept exposure to Iranian retaliation. This is the current state. The Gulf states face existential threats from disrupted export revenues, and hydrocarbon exports remain the foundation of GCC government budgets. Energy infrastructure continues to absorb strikes. Tourism collapses. Aviation routes shut down. A prolonged disruption will reduce overseas investment and could trigger disinvestment as governments redirect capital toward domestic economic stability. The cost of staying the course is fiscal collapse before the war ends. Option 2. Demand the U.S. provide Israel-level defensive systems and priority protection. The disparity in U.S. support for Israel versus Gulf allies highlights a clear hierarchy. There is no co-development, no comparable intelligence integration, no equivalent political protection. Washington will not restructure 75 years of alliance doctrine to elevate Gulf partners above Israel in the defense priority queue. The request would be denied. The resentment would deepen. This option assumes leverage that does not exist. Option 3. Eject U.S. forces and declare neutrality. Neutrality is no longer measured by official statements or diplomatic declarations, but by the operational environment, such as military infrastructure and security partnerships. The U.S. already evacuated hundreds of troops from Al Udeid and Bahrain in late February as a precaution. Formal base closures would end American security commitments entirely. At present, no country has the capacity or interest to offer a security guarantee like that ostensibly provided by the United States. Neutrality without a replacement guarantor leaves them structurally exposed to the next regional power that decides their territory matters. Option 4. Withdraw Gulf investments from the U.S. to pressure Washington into changing course. GCC sovereign wealth funds hold trillions of dollars in investments in the United States and Europe. A withdrawal would hurt American markets. It would also drain the fiscal reserves Gulf states need to survive revenue collapse from frozen energy exports. The review is examining whether force majeure clauses can be invoked in contracts to alleviate economic strain from the war, especially if expenses continue at the same pace. The leverage cuts both ways. The damage is mutual. The outcome is degradation, not resolution. These governments are not paralyzed because they lack competence. They are paralyzed because the structure has no option that does not cost more than the problem it is trying to solve. For the Gulf Cooperation Council, this is not a crisis. It is a structural break. 3 months ago, these states operated under a 33-year security model: fund American presence, receive protection, avoid direct conflict with Iran, maintain energy export dominance. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 hinges on stability, foreign investment, and avoiding regional war, conditions gravely threatened by Trump's threats to strike Iran and Israel's widening military campaign. What has changed at the operational level is the collapse of the assumption that hosting U.S. forces reduces vulnerability. The very existence of the U.S. bases made Gulf states a direct battleground for the war rather than protecting them. Qatar declared force majeure after suspending LNG production following a drone strike on its main facility, and Saudi Arabia's largest oil refinery was also hit. Their current emergency responses, examining whether force majeure clauses can be legally invoked in existing and future financial agreements with Washington. Reviewing investment commitments to the United States. Holding joint discussions on budget strains. publicly questioning whether their funding supports peace initiatives or wars that expose them to danger. These are not the actions of governments that have found an answer. They are the actions of governments buying time while they try to find one. Every major actor is watching the Gulf calculus and drawing conclusions that will reshape alignments for the next decade. Europe. European economies have already absorbed substantial costs after the EU imposed a ban on Russian energy, set to be completed by 2027, following the invasion of Ukraine. Now Gulf energy supplies, the alternative to Russian flows, face disruption from a US-initiated conflict. The lesson Brussels is drawing: American security partnerships create energy supply risk, not stability. Expect accelerated diversification away from both Russian and Gulf dependency. China. Gulf sovereign wealth funds have been primary investors in American and European markets. If governments redirect capital toward domestic economic stability, Beijing positions itself as the stable alternative partner. No military bases on Gulf soil. No ideological demands, just infrastructure investment and energy purchase agreements that do not come with missile defense failures. Turkey. Qatar signed a mutual defense treaty with Ankara, which led to Turkey's first military base in the Middle East in 2016. If U.S. security guarantees prove hollow under actual conflict conditions, Ankara offers an operational model: military partnership without the target acquisition that comes from hosting American strike capabilities. Qatar already tested this during the 2017-2021 Saudi-led blockade. The model works. Regional powers watching. The escalation between the United States and Iran has exposed the limits of traditional Gulf neutrality. The Gulf states are facing a highly delicate strategic choice: to become part of an escalation whose trajectory they cannot control, or to manage the threat with strategic composure that prevents the conflict from spreading. Every non-aligned state sees the lesson. Alliance with Washington guarantees neither protection nor consultation before being dragged into war. We are in that gap now. The gap between the collapse of the old Gulf security order and the construction of whatever replaces it. Al Udeid Air Base, the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, Prince Sultan Air Base, Ali Al Salam, Camp Buehring, Ras Tanura Refinery, Ras Laffan LNG Terminal, the Strait of Hormuz, trillions of dollars in sovereign wealth fund holdings, force majeure contract reviews spanning investment pledges, sports sponsorships, business contracts, and asset sales. This is the strategic reality that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait woke up to on March 6, 2026. It did not exist 14 days earlier. It cannot be reversed. What began as a decapitation strike intended to collapse the Iranian regime has triggered a cascading crisis: disruption of Gulf energy exports, rising pressure on global energy markets, an existential threat to the GCC states, and new strategic opportunities for Russia. Increasingly, the costs of the conflict are falling not on Iran alone, but on the United States and its partners across Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. The old security compact is gone. American bases no longer function as shields. They function as target designators. The question now is what gets built in its place, and whether the process of building it stays below the threshold of fiscal collapse, alliance rupture, and permanent energy market reconfiguration. The Gulf states did not approve this war. They explicitly told Washington not to launch it from their territory. They are now paying for it anyway, in infrastructure damage, export revenue loss, defense expenditure increases, and the realization that 33 years of security partnership did not include the right to say no when it mattered most. 3 directional questions with no clean answers. First, if Gulf states formalize investment withdrawals and invoke force majeure clauses across hundreds of billions in U.S. contracts, does Washington accept the economic damage to preserve the alliance structure, or does it retaliate and accelerate the decoupling? Second, which non-U.S. security guarantor has both the capability and willingness to fill the vacuum if American bases close: China through economic leverage, Turkey through direct military partnership, or a new multilateral Gulf Defense Pact that includes tactical accommodation with Iran? Third, at what energy price point does Europe break with U.S. Middle East policy to secure independent Gulf supply agreements? And does that threshold get crossed before or after the next round of Iranian infrastructure strikes? Leave your honest assessment in the comments. The most important conversations on this channel happen there. This is not theoretical. The sovereign wealth fund managers, foreign ministry officials, and energy strategists making these decisions are working from the same data you just reviewed. Share this with anyone in your life who is serious about understanding where Gulf security architecture is actually going, not where the think tanks in Washington say it should go. Until the next update, stay sharp, stay ahead, and never stop asking the questions that matter.